Anyways, welcome to my talk. It is essentially on hardware hacking fundamentals and like a high-level overview of various like sub-areas of hardware hacking. It's by me. I am Zach, allegedly, to the best of your info. Obviously it's on hardware hacking, but before we start talking about hardware hacking, it's better to talk about normal hacking, because it's like a fair chance it's just a weird buzzword to a lot of you that you've seen in the news that Russia's launched like 15 cyber nukes. You're like, what's a cyber nuke? Defining it's kind of hard, like where do you draw the line in the sand of like what is hacking, what isn't hacking. For the purposes of this talk, I'm just saying that it's compromising security through bugs or flaws in technology. And obviously that's still a bunch of just like buzzwords, but we'll go through each of them in like greater detail throughout the talk so you can actually know what it means. But then, of course, it's on hardware hacking. That is just a sub-area of hacking where we sort of have the same goal of compromising security to some sort of benefit, but specifically we're talking about targeting hardware as our means to do that. It's important to note that if you actually find this talk interesting and go to like look up stuff later, there's also a common alternative meaning, which is more about just like modding technology, but isn't really related to security. So that's something to watch out for and keep in mind, because you get a lot of that intermixed with like any search results or whatever. So we talked about compromising security, but what does that actually look like? Because you want some sort of actually benefit to doing this. There's like lots of reasons, but some common ones. A, you want to run your own code on like some hardware you've given. Pretty often manufacturers want just their code to run on it and for it to not be replaced with custom stuff. So they put in some sort of protections, but you can typically try and bypass those with various hardware hacking techniques. Related to that is often there's hidden functionality on hardware. Often there might be, say, a base version of a like hardware board and a pro version. It's not uncommon that they just send you the same version because they're lazy, but they just lock functionality for the base one of hardware stuff, which you can unlock. So that might be like a crypto processor for a certain sort of like board might be locked, or BMW has fairly recently started shipping heated seats, which you have to pay a subscription for. That hardware, when you buy the car, is obviously just going to be somewhere sitting in it, and you can use hardware hacking to get access to that without paying them like $20 a month or whatever. And then lastly, perhaps the most like immediately relevant one is becoming admin on a given computer. You probably don't care if it's your personal computer, but if you do it on a UNSW computer, then you go edit your student profile, set your WAM to like 200 because you're feeling daring, and you like live a happy life. Alright, so now we've talked about like compromising security and sort of things you're probably looking out for hardware-wise. Let's actually talk about what is hardware, because once again it's one of those concepts where it's like you see hardware, you're like, oh, it's hardware, but you don't know the precise definition. Thing is that hardware is actually pretty diverse, and you get a lot of like very specialized and interesting circuits. Those are good, but we'll be talking about, I guess, the biggest like area or like lowest common denominator, which is that like you can mainly think of just the parts in your computer as the things we'll be looking at mainly. The most important two for those are the CPU, which is at the fundamental level what's going to actually be executing your code for you. And the memory, which is another piece of hardware which stores values for the CPU, because obviously the CPU can't remember everything. It doesn't remember your friend's birthday from Facebook. It needs to store that somewhere, which is what the memory is typically doing. Now, we've talked about hardware, but what does a bug or flaw look like in a piece of hardware? Once again, there's various types. We really only want ones which we think could actually be of use to us security-wise. So we talked about the CPU, which is something that's executing your code. A bug which we might find interesting in that is if we can skip some code. If we can skip specific parts of code, you might be able to skip an important security check somewhere, and get access to something we shouldn't have. Or we've got memory. If we can like alter it when we shouldn't be able to, the CPU will just trust the values in that memory and act accordingly. So you could just, related to maybe the hacking talk we just saw, like edit a value that might be your health in game, and the CPU will just read that and act like its new value is the proper one accordingly. So we've got these bugs in hardware. Rather thankfully, your manufacturer is not just selling you a terrible piece of hardware which doesn't work and has bugs happening in it all the time. These products are typically quite tested to ensure that, they work properly under normal operating conditions. However, because you can assume, at least typically, that we have physical access to this hardware, you can mess with it yourself in malicious ways. Generally, this is just called fault injection. Fault is just the error or bug that we're causing in the hardware. Injection means that we're purposefully causing that to happen through some sort of, means. It's like you're purposely messing with the hardware, you're trying to cause some spectacular crash to occur. Before we go into specifically the CPU and how we can inject faults into that, a quick overview on more like, CPU internals real quick. CPU, once again, it executes code. I'll just be calling those instructions for, each individual bit of code that it's executing. And also very importantly, the CPU has in it a clock which schedules its execution. And that is something to keep in mind because that's what we'll be targeting soon. Yeah, so clock injection is essentially where the CPU has a clock which schedules it, but because we have direct access to it, we can essentially override that clock signal with our own one to cause these faults. Typically, we're going to be overriding that with a faster clock, which the CPU will not be able to keep up with and start malfunctioning. Because you've probably seen like, the CPU in my gaming laptop is like 4 gigahertz or whatever. That's its speed. It can't just magically start running it at 8 gigahertz with no issues. Like something's going to go fundamentally wrong. Talking a bit more about how clock injection actually works, the clock is really, the heart of the CPU. Each time it ticks, that is what triggers like everything else in the CPU to actually stay alive and keep running. We can essentially inject our own clock. We do this by, we have our own custom hardware typically, and it'll literally generate the same signal, and we can physically attach it to the circuit. And that ends up overriding the clock signal, but it's just sort of blindly accepted by the CPU. Because the CPU can't keep up, because it can't properly propagate all the actual effects of whatever it's running, it starts malfunctioning and skipping instructions, which is something quite interested in security-wise. So what can we do with the CPU not completing instructions? You can imagine you're trying to become admin, set your WAM to 300, and you're asked for a password, because obviously only an admin should be able to do that. You probably don't know the password, or you wouldn't be in such a issue. So instead you're going to enter garbage, and at some point this is going to boil down to one instruction which is going to compare these two inputs. Now, if you execute normally, like it should, the CPU is going to execute that compare, going to see they don't match, something's wrong, and you're not going to set your WAM to 400. So instead, we now decide to do some clock injection. Like I said, so you start doing the clock injection when the compare's happening. Because the clock is faster, it starts performing the next instruction before the compare is really done. So the compare is essentially lost somewhere, and we can essentially skip it. We don't execute it. And because we've bypassed that compare, we can run the command as admin. And really that's how you can use a bug, which is maybe not initially useful, to compromise the security, at least in this example, by running stuff as admin. And that is the main parts of fault injection. So bugs for the CPU, which occur via fault injection, specifically clock injection in this example. Now that we're done with fault injection, which is, I guess, one area of hardware hacking, moving on to side channel analysis, which is another different area of hardware hacking. This slide's a bit abstract. We'll get into a proper explanation a bit later. But essentially, hardware typically has some sort of secret. Once again, that might be a cryptography key, or once again, that might be a password. And it shouldn't disclose those freely because then they're not really secrets. Instead, we can often use hardware, like different aspects of it, to leak information that a developer might not have considered. A very classic example of this is you have an electrical pin lock. And so what you consider the main channel of information is, does the lock unlock or does the lock stay locked? And you really only see that once you've entered the entire password. And that's pretty hard to actually get access to if you're just brute forcing it one by one. There can be millions of combinations. Specifically, you can consider a scenario of a pin lock, 6 digits, and they set it to a password that you would never get a chance, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we're going to assume that the code sitting inside the lock is going to compare this digit by digit. And we're going to use timing analysis, which is a fancy way of saying we're going to see how long the code is running for on the actual hardware and use that to leak information about the password. Now, and you typically do that by, once again, attaching your own hardware and measuring, once again, how long it takes to run, because in a processor it's going to run in a fraction of a second. You can't exactly do that with a stopwatch. Now, you can imagine you have access to the lock and you're hammering in these combinations. If you put in 6 zeros, it's going to get rejected almost immediately. The code essentially takes your input, it compares the first digit, and it rejects it. And that still does take a little bit of time for the processor to actually run all those instructions. However, if you then enter 1 and 5 zeros, that code should get rejected slightly later. And that's because it loads in the first digit, 1, which is the correct one because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The compare will succeed, so we'll load the second digit and compare that. Because we've executed more instructions, it's going to take slightly longer, and that way we can tell that we've actually matched a single digit correctly. If you repeat that process each time, you can then get each digit. So the time of execution actually manages to tell you if each individual digit is correct, which mathematically shrinks it from 10 to the 6th number of combinations to 6 times 10, which is shrinking the number of combinations you need for this lock to actually break in. It's sort of like, okay, Wordle reference, back to COVID. If you just got the answer, if you only guess the entire word correctly each time, it would be a lot harder to play. But because it tells you if individual letters are correct, you can guess the word. And that's typically what timing analysis is actually doing for us. And so yeah, there's some sort of secret we want to know, and we don't know it through the main channel because it's not a secret. The lock's not going to just tell us if it's incorrect or not, besides just when we get it fully correct. Side channel analysis doesn't actually mess with the hardware or purposely cause a bug, but rather just more subtly uses various aspects of the hardware to get extra information. And with timing analysis, we can essentially leak what a pin lock would be, and if you're a robber, then you can get access to the bank or whatever and steal money and be happy. And that is essentially the main part of the talk, which was what hardware hacking is, essentially a sub-area of hacking, targeting, hardware for some sort of gain. Those gains are typically getting access to extra functionality, escalating privileges to become admin, getting your own code on proprietary stuff. And then some important sub-areas are fault injection, purposely causing bugs to get behavior you might want, or side channel analysis, where we use side channels to get extra information about secrets. One last slide is just some resources if people find this interesting and want to do further research. There's a good book on hardware hacking. It's introductory, but only as introductory as you can be while still getting into the actual details and nastiness of hardware hacking. And then 2 YouTubers who I think are pretty good. One who does hardware hacking videos and one who just does more general hardware stuff. And that is the talk. Yeah, do you have a question?
Quick question. You talked about overclocking, but I've actually heard people use that for making their computers more performant. Can you just kind of clarify the difference?
Yeah, so your CPU has a frequency for the clock that it runs at, and the faster that clock is, the faster you execute code. Typically there's a range for which your CPU works, and overclocking is, increasing that speed even further to get better performance. But naturally, it's very similar to, I guess, clock injection, but naturally there's a sort of limit with overclocking before it stops really working. Like, you can't overclock to double your performance or whatever. Whereas clock injection is literally setting the clock speed to double or triple, and your code doesn't start running at triple the speed, it starts malfunctioning instead. So it's, instead of slightly increasing the CPU speed for better performance, massively increasing it for malfunctioning purposes. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
When you do the clock injection, it causes it to skip the instruction, but how do you know that you're skipping the compare instruction and not some other instruction?
Yeah, okay, so that, because this is a high-level overview, I don't get into the nasty details, but that is a very relevant question to hardware hacking, is, a very important part of the hardware hacking process typically is figuring out how to actually time when you're going to, inject the fault so that it actually works and hits the part you're interested in. Occasionally, it varies from target to target. Occasionally there's some sort of signal that you can use to synchronize your exploit, but very often in hardware hacking you just set up a way to automate it, and you're I'm going to try a million different attempts, each at a different delay, and measure if they work or not, and use that to formulate when you're going to actually inject faults. Because you can't inject too many faults, because then your essentially hardware just doesn't work. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
What kind of hardware do you use for hardware hacking?
Okay, so it varies a bit. There are some specialized chips which are made for hardware hacking by the authors of this hardware hacking book, which I like, which sort of have inbuilt functionality for, you can sort of attach them to the hardware that you're looking into, and it will have inbuilt stuff for fault injection and side channel analysis. But really, if you just have an FPGA, you can probably just sort of build your own, albeit it'll be hard, then you'll have to have a proper understanding of building the hardware tools. Cool. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. That's the talk.